Good morning, everyone. First, thank you very much for the opportunity to the organisers, and perhaps particularly to Simone Maynard for getting me this opportunity to talk to you all this morning about the work that we've been doing at an international level around integrating environmental information within the standard national accounts, which is the framework used to measure GDP, which you're probably fairly familiar with, or at least aware of. Rob indicated my background, a long background with the Australian Bureau of Statistics, and most of my career was working in the national accounts area. So, and for 5 years I was the head of the National Accounts Department at the Australian Bureau of Statistics. So in some senses I feel as a national accountant and a person who compiled GDP very actively, I may be walking into a dangerous situation because there are so many criticisms of it. But I'm hopeful that I might be able to take you through some of the aspects of how some of the debate around that is changing a little bit and what it might mean for people in your situation around ecosystem services. I should note as well, so my background is as an economist, so putting professions out there, but I've ended up being what I consider myself now a national accountant, which is somewhat a different thing. Okay, so the session, the talk is divided into 3 parts. One is to give you some background to the whole process around some work that's been going on, particularly over the last 3 years that I've been involved in. The second part is to look at some technical stuff to try and explain to you what it is we've done around ecosystems, ecosystem measurement, and particularly ecosystem services. And the third part is I've picked up this new phrase of take forward messages. I think it's a good way to go. So I don't know whether many of you would recognise this person here. His name is Simon Kuznets, very thoughtful pose. Simon Kuznets was a leading economist around the 20s and 30s and 40s, and was one of the leading people in the development of the national accounts and the measure of GDP as we know it, which was essentially developed in the context of the economic crisis that took place during the 1930s. And at that stage, they really didn't have any clear idea of what the economy was doing. They had a few random indicators that they were trying to put together and trying to get economic policy based on that. So they brought together a group of highly intelligent people who put together this measure of economic activity that we now know and to some degree at least accept. The point in that case, the reason for doing it, mentioning it here, is that at that time, Simon Kuznets was clear that, in actual fact, what was developed as GDP was not a complete measure. He knew what they were doing was for a particular purpose, and there were limitations in it at the time. So, in a sense, the seeds of trying to look beyond GDP, which has become a mantra over particularly the last 10, 15, 20 years, started right at the outset. And so it's worthwhile thinking about. The other point that I think is important is that the GDP and the national accounts came out of a crisis situation. It was a response to try and see whether they could bring together information to tell them in a broad sense what was going on. This gentleman you may recognise, it's Robert Kennedy. Here he's giving a speech in 1968 at the University of Kansas. And it's quite a famous speech, I guess if you're looking for it. It's one where he's having a critique of GDP. By 1968, GDP had become quite entrenched. It went through a bit of a rocky time as to whether or not it was going to hang around or not in its first 4 or 5 years, but by 30 years after its sort of initial putting together, it was pretty entrenched in the psyche of what happens. But Robert Kennedy at that point said his critique of GDP was that it measures everything except that which makes life worthwhile. So right at that point, it was still very recognised that in actual fact there were some problems. We moved forward another 20 years, and the Brundtland Commission came along, focusing on sustainable development, led to the Rio conference, and at that time, one of the recommendations out of in Agenda 21 was around the development of environmental economic accounts, to try and see whether or not there was some way of integrating into the standard national accounts and GDP some way of adjusting it for environmental costs and those types of things. Move forward another 20 years, Rio plus 20, and there was still recognition of this need to have these integrated measures to go beyond GDP, and there was a paragraph 38 in the recommendations that came out of Rio Plus 20 to that effect, encouraging the statistical organisations the official statistical organisations of the world to try and expand their measures to go beyond economic measures. So in all of that context, the question is what might have been happening. It wasn't through lack of effort in terms of a lot of people knowing there should be something done, but from my perspective as a member of the international official statistical community, all of the national statistical offices in each country started work, and which has culminated in a couple of publications. But to take you back a bit, after the recommendation of the first Rio meeting to develop environmental economic accounts, there was an interim book put together called the Interim System of Environmental Economic Accounting, which largely tried to say, this is what we know at the moment in the early 90s. This is what we know about how you might adjust GDP and the national accounts more generally for environmental costs, degradation, depletion, etc. It didn't take off as a standard. It was accepted that more work needed to be done, but it kicked off, and they also formed an expert group called the London Group, which has met on a reasonably regular basis over the past 20 years to take forward these measurement issues and accounting issues. In 2003, another book, Seer 2003, was put together to try and say how things had advanced over that previous 10 years. It didn't become the nature of a standard, but it did reflect quite a broad consensus about what might be done. And in particular, it moved from just seeing how you might adjust GDP to more broadly how you might reflect flows in the environment, environmental flows in an accounting context. And then with the continued pressure to try and see how it might be that we could go beyond GDP, the United Nations Statistical Commission, which meets once every year in New York, started a process in 2007 which said, well, we've done this work over the last 15 years or so. Can we bring it all together and make it an international statistical standard about how countries could go about putting together environmental economic accounts and expanding the range of information beyond the standard economic data that's in the standard national accounts. So the process for drafting the Seer came into being, and I came into that process a couple of years in, and so for the last 3 years I've been working on developing this as a process of consultation with a whole range of experts, particularly in the statistical community, to take this forward. And in February of 2012, so about 18 months ago now, the book on your left, called The Central Framework, was adopted by the Statistical Commission as an international standard. So it now has the status of the same measures, that there's a standard that underlies the compilation of GDP, and there's now a standard which underlies the compilation of a whole range of environmental data feeding into the national accounts. So it's quite a significant step. There are in actual fact only 2 standards of that type in the statistical world. There's a whole range of classifications and other things, but these ones are the only 2 standards. So it's really elevated this type of issue to a really quite significant level within the official statistics community. But we also decided we needed to go beyond that. There were to get to a standard, we need to make, everyone had to agree, and not everyone could agree on degradation and how to measure it, and that was then wrapped up into the issue of ecosystems. And so a separate body of work which has now been called, with the one with a feather on the front, experimental ecosystem accounting, has been put together over the last 18 months or so to try and bring together where it's up to. It's not a standard. It's basically a way of thinking about how information about ecosystems might be put into an accounting context. And that's essentially the guts of the technical stuff that I'll be talking about in a couple of minutes. I've just thrown this slide in so that when you do get to look at the slides, you've got some links to the actual documents themselves which are available. We're not yet published. The UN publication process can take some time. We're getting very close. On the first one, the Central Framework, I've seen the front cover, and the experimental ecosystem accounting will probably take another, well, if it gets there by Christmas, I think we're doing quite well. We've also written a third book, which is also still getting close to final, called Applications and Extensions. because what we felt was there wasn't, while we had developed a book which outlined sort of conceptually how you would derive a lot of indicators, how these information could be used in analysis, we needed to give people examples of how that could be done to try and sort of bridge the gap between the compilers and the analysts and policymakers on the other hand. So that's a book underway at the moment. The draft is the one at the link. What's happened since the international standard came into force at the beginning of last year, but particularly through our efforts to try and engage with ecosystem accounting and ecosystem measurement, we've almost fallen into a whole range of relationships, particularly at the international level, but in a whole range of other projects, which have all recognised the need for information in order to inform the types of decisions they want to take. Many of these you may have heard of. The Sustainable Development Goals, post-2015 agenda, whole range of projects within UNEP, the World Bank. The OECD Green Growth is quite an interesting one in the sense that they've recognised that the organisation of environmental and economic data in a common framework basically provides them a way in which they can sort of monitor and assess issues around green growth policies. Very closely connected with the Convention on Biological Diversity, who developed a target a number of years ago to, by 2020, they were going to integrate biodiversity measures into the national accounts. They hadn't actually talked to any national accountants before they wrote that. They just thought it was a good idea. And so we're now working with them, and they're starting to see, and there's actually in the ecosystem accounting book, there's actually quite a large section on how you can account for biodiversity, and there's sort of thoughts about how you might integrate that within broader measures. It was mentioned the other day, the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services has also been interested in how whether the Seer might be an organising framework for some of their information and collection. And you can see a range of other people that, and organisations that we've been engaged with. And it's been a wonderful process. It's actually somewhat unusual for official statisticians to get out and mix in these types of circles. A lot of the time we like to think of ourselves as independent, and as a result we get the best quality statistics because we do it all ourselves. Unfortunately, being independent shouldn't mean not talking to anyone else, but often that can be the case. So culturally it's been a big change, and it's a very positive development, I think, all around. Going that way. Right, so onto the technical stuff. Because I've been working on this technical stuff for 3 years, I had a lot of trouble trying to work out what I should cover. And in actual fact, I've been doing a lot of thinking over that 3 years about, I can tend to get a bit philosophical at times. And so I'm going to start here. This guy is a guy by the name of Luca Pacioli, who was an Italian monk, come mathematician, in the late 1400s, early 1500s. Worked in Venice and wrote a book on mathematics in which he had a chapter on double entry accounting. And essentially what he wrote at that time remains the essence of accounting as we know it today. So he was the first one to basically put the thing together. And it's really quite a remarkable story. And yeah, so he's there, and the real question is, it's not that he was thinking of environmental costs and degradation. It's not that he was thinking of GDP. He was only thinking it from a business point of view. Where does accounting fit in, and how is it that I can do a better job of understanding a business and doing it? They weren't his businesses, but just helping him out as a friendly mathematician. So what is it about an accounting approach which really makes a difference? The thing that Pacioli found and introduced was this notion of stocks and flows. In the past, what most businesses had done was just focus on their sales. What Pacioli introduced was the idea that you needed to know not only what you'd sold, but you needed to know how much you had at the start of the year in your inventory and how much you had at the end, how much you'd bought in, and so that you married it all together so you got an overall assessment. So it's no good having lots of sales if you'd run out of stock or that you hadn't managed your processes around inventory. This whole notion of stocks and flows is really the central message around accounting. In actual fact, it's forgotten by many accountants, to be perfectly honest. But I think when you start thinking about it in an environmental sense, the notion of a system which measures both stocks and flows is central, and I think it's why accounting can actually work quite well. But it goes back to this guy over 500 years ago. What it means is you get this full and comprehensive, internally consistent approach to measurement and putting the information together in a way that's organised. But you have to define certain measurement boundaries in order to do that. If you're going to be consistent and going to be internally consistent, you have to have a boundary within which you operate. So accountants will define boundaries. What's current? What's capital? What's the edge of your asset boundary? How all those things work. And then once they've decided those boundaries, there's a complete accounting for everything that happened from the beginning of the period to the end of the period, whether that's 1 year or 5 years. So you're explaining everything in the middle. And there's the relationships that sit in there between supply and use. So all these things must balance. So the notion of balancing is a very fundamental feature of accounting. Also fundamental is that it measures change over time. So it's not just done as a one-off measure of a flow or a one-off measure of a stock. The idea of accounting is that you measure it from one point in time to another point in time, and then you start again and keep moving forward. So this ability to tell a message, to inform on trends, is also a fundamental feature of accounting. Because you have to work from these measurement boundaries, one of the features of accounting as it's developed is that companies and countries have basically come to some agreement around what those measurement boundaries are. So what's the production that we're going to include in our economic activity? What assets are we going to include? How are we going to define the difference between current expenditure and capital expenditure if you're a company? And once you've got agreement on that, and there's international accounting standards for companies, once you've got agreement on that, you can start comparing between countries and companies because you're using the same concept. You might all go about it in slightly different ways, but you're all trying to measure exactly the same concept. And that's where a lot of the power and the support for accounting comes through, is because you're measuring these similar concepts. All right. Another way to think about accounting, this is what we call an information pyramid. Often there's a lot of focus by policymakers on the indicators. That could include things like GDP, inflation measures, a whole range of different efficiency and productivity indicators and those types of things. But what you've got is a very wide range of data that might be out there in different databases across different places and slightly different definitions, lots of surveys, administrative data, different sources. And the idea of accounts essentially becomes a filter. So how can we take all of that information that's out there and bring it into some organised form, which means we've captured all of that information but place it in context. And then you can derive some indicators from that as a result of knowing that, because the accounts actually are composed of relationships between different variables. So you can derive those indicators as a result. And that ability of accounts to organise information was one that was recognised by Nobel laureate Paul Samuelson, a great American economist, who noted that without measures of economic aggregates like GDP, and by implication the National Accounting Framework, you're just in a drift in a sea of unorganised data. So it would be similar to the idea of back in the 30s, trying to make economic policy when you just had a very random selection of information about the economy. You didn't know whether you're probably sure you weren't covering it all, but how could you find out which bits you had and which bits you hadn't? It's the same principle that we're trying to apply when we extend the system of national accounts, which looks at GDP, to integrate environmental data. Okay. So, what's in the Seer? Essentially 5 broad areas. The first 4 areas, up to land accounting, are included in that document, the Seer Central Framework. So they comprise the international standard of the environmental economic accounting. So it's in those 4 parts. Physical flow accounting, it's where we look at data in physical terms, i.e. not monetary terms. So it could be cubic metres of water, joules of energy, tonnes of emissions, tonnes of waste, and try and look at all of the flows of energy. I'll take the example of energy. Take all the flows of energy into the economy, look at how that energy is transformed and moved around between different industries and to households for consumption, and then the release of that energy back out into the environment. So these are called physical supply and use tables. A normal supply and use table for the economy just looks at products moving around between industries and households and government within the economy. What we try and do in physical flow accounting is look at those flows into the economy and back out again. And the essence of why this can work is that what the Seer does, it's not that you couldn't do this without connection to economic accounts, but we try and use exactly the same structures around industry, around households, the boundary around the production boundary about where the economy starts and finishes in physical terms is the same and aligns with what happens in the system of national accounts. So you can make these comparisons to GDP and other economic variables. The second area is loosely called accounting for environmental activities. So many of you would have heard of things like green employment, green jobs, these types of, and there's often a debate about what's green. How would you constitute that? What we've tried to do is make essentially a definition of what we call environmental activities, which are those current economic activities which might be considered environmental, and essentially falls into two categories: environmental protection activity, undertaken by businesses, governments, households, and resource management activity, where you're managing natural resources and those types of assets. We also cover in there definitions of environmental taxes, definitions of environmental subsidies, and a range of other treatments of current economic activity, but from the perspective of an environmental sort of viewpoint. The third area is natural resource accounting, and this is where we get into measures of depletion. We look at it from the perspective of stocks, the changes in additions to the stock, reductions in the stock, and the closing stock, so it's a sort of a balance sheet and asset account. And we do that for a whole range of things such as mineral and energy resources, soil, timber, fish, water. I think that's about it. So that's another important area. And then we have an area on land accounting, where we're looking at changes in land cover, changes in land use, beginning of period, what was the mix of land use, end of period, what was the mix of land use, how did it change in the middle. I mean, I should caveat that it's not the case that any of these are necessarily simple to measure. What we describe in the Seer is not, it's not a book full of numbers, it's a book full of words about the concepts, the boundaries, the definitions, and those sorts of things that would work in order to bring it all together in a framework. There's some example tables in there to show you that it does add up, but it's then the process of countries taking that and then saying, all right, I'll have a go at doing a water account, or I'll have a go at accounting for depletion of my mineral resources. And they take these definitions and concepts and try and bring it all together. So that constituted our central framework and a standard, those top four categories. But this issue of ecosystem accounting sort of came along and essentially motivated by a discussion around environmental degradation. How would you look at degradation in adjusting GDP? Which had become basically the very thorny issue in the discussion around the manual that was written around in 2003. There was really no consensus at all, and sort of really quite passionate debates about how it should be done. And that was, in a sense, before the advent of ecosystem services. And I think it's really important to note that in taking forward the area on ecosystem accounting, the emerging work on ecosystem services that we've tried to pick up on in our guidelines does take the accounting a significant step forward compared to where it was 10 years ago. And I think that's a positive message to you all. It does make the accounting doesn't make it easier per se, but conceptually it takes it forward in quite a large step. What we've tried to do is make a synthesis of what we could find. We did it fairly quickly. It was written over a period of about 12 months with consultation not massively wide, but we tried to get a broad suite of people that we could find and organisations involved in ecosystems. We weren't trying to make a standard, we were just trying to get, well, how can we bring this stuff together, and can we take what we know about ecosystem services and other ecosystem measurements, biodiversity, can we put it into an accounting framework? And essentially that's what I'd like to, I think that's what my next slide, oh no, and that's what I will run through with you after this slide. One of the critical issues in understanding the relationship between, say, natural resource accounting and ecosystem accounting is what the asset boundary is. So when you're an accountant, you really like to have these boundaries around the edge so you know what's in and what's out. So that's just a sort of statistician thing as well. First point on natural capital or environmental assets, we actually use the term, we don't actually use the words natural capital anywhere in the Seer. And it sort of, partly given that I was sort of leading the drafting, it was partly a personal preference. I mean, lots of other people read it as well. But we've gone with the phrase environmental assets, but it's largely around the problem with the use of the term natural. Because the boundary of what is natural and what is not natural is quite problematic. And certainly it came through in the discussions around ecosystem accounting that in actual fact, it can be pretty hard to find an ecosystem that's not influenced in some way by human activity. So where would you... So the word natural capital, I think, can sometimes be, people have their own perceptions about what natural is. We've used the term environmental assets to capture both what might be considered pure or natural, as well as those things which may be more cultivated. So it includes things like agricultural landscapes, it'll include plantation forests, those types of things are all within the boundary of environmental assets that we're trying to pick up, the whole biophysical environment, irrespective of the degree of human intervention. The other thing that was a particular problem was we had all these resources, mineral and energy, soil, water, timber, fish, and what would often happen is you'd add on ecosystems to the bottom of this sort of list of assets. And it proved singularly unhelpful in a way, because once you'd done that, you sort of had to accept that in actual fact some of those resources up the top, so if you think of it in a classification sense, you had a particular problem because timber and fish, for example, or just take timber, it's clearly within an ecosystem. So where should I put my trees? Should I put my trees up the top in the timber, or should I put them in the ecosystem? So this was it was recognised that there might be a double counting. So we've taken a different approach in writing the Seer. And I put a coin up there because for me, this is the way I try and visualise it, is that we have one environment. There's one environment out there, and that's represented by the coin. But you can look at it from two perspectives. So if you look at the kangaroo side, I have to try and remember what's on the other side. Probably a king or queen of some sort. If you look from the kangaroos, let's go with the kangaroo side. Actually, no, let's go with the king or queen side on the back. Let's imagine that's the view of looking at things as individual resources or individual environmental assets. That's the timber, the fish, the water, the soil, the minerals. That's one view that you can take of having a go at measuring the environment and how it's changed over time. The other side of the coin, the kangaroo side, is your ecosystem approach, where you're looking at how all of those things together operate as a system. And in actual fact, you're sort of capturing other things in there as well, but nonetheless, you're sort of trying to, but it's basically two approaches to looking at the same thing. And so it's that dual perspective that we're taking. So one side, the central framework, the standard side, looks at the individual resources and accounting for depletion and all those things. The ecosystem accounting approach is to look at things from an ecosystem or a system perspective and take things forward from there. Okay, so what does our ecosystem accounting model look like? I should apologise up front. From my reading of ecosystem literature over the last 18 months or so, there are many terms used in many different ways. In order to create a synthesis, we had to make some choices. Now, I'm not going to put up definitions because I figured that's just a recipe for disaster. You'll have to read the book to find out how we define things. But we've chosen some terms. More important for me is the relationship between the various elements, not in actual fact the words we've used to put it together. But we had to make some choices, otherwise I could, otherwise I'd haven't, we couldn't get anywhere. So we start off with the idea of an ecosystem asset. And that could be a forest, a wetland, it could be a region, it could be a landscape, it's some spatial area. Within that area, there are a range of ecosystem processes, a range of ecosystem characteristics around what the environment looks like, how it operates. And there's a series of flows which will happen within the ecosystem and some exchanges between different ecosystems. We then have a whole set of ecosystem services which emerge from that asset. And we classify them following a fairly sort of standard set. We've used the CICES as a way of classifying things into provisioning, regulating and cultural. It's certainly still that classification issue is still one under discussion, but nonetheless it's important to see that we've got that in there. And those ecosystem services then feed into what we call benefits. So there's a clear distinction there. These benefits arise as a result of both a contribution from ecosystem services and contributions from human inputs. Now, in order to allow integration with the national accounts and GDP, we make a distinction between two different types of benefits. One are what we call, and it's the labels here are really poor, sort of S&A benefits, which are those benefits which are already counted in GDP. So that's your agricultural production, tourism activity, water, those types of things. So to the extent that ecosystem services contribute to the production of those goods and services, they're called S&A benefits. Things that are outside, a lot of the regulating services and perhaps quite a few of your non-use ecosystem services are called non-S&A benefits. And those benefits in turn contribute to well-being. Now, when it comes to measurement, which I won't go into any detail on, we attempt to measure the ecosystem asset and we attempt to measure, we describe measurement for the ecosystem services. And it's certainly, so it's a measure of stocks, looking at the ecosystem asset. How has your ecosystem asset changed over time? What was its condition like at the beginning of the period? What was it like at the end of the period, and how did it change over time? And then separately measuring the flows that come from that asset, the ecosystem services. Perhaps an analogy from an economic point of view, the asset would be something like a house, and the services are the flows of rents that people pay to live in the house for a particular year. Okay? And you can look at the condition of the house and separately look at the rents. And in economic terms, they should be related, but they're quite different concepts. One of the challenges is, of course, trying to take that sort of model and take it up to a national scale, which is the ambition from a Seer perspective. It's not about trying to do it just in one area, but how do you make the assessments and organise information at a national level. The range of problems then in aggregation, and I have to be perfectly honest, the Seer doesn't solve any of these. All we've done is basically said these are challenges that need to be met. There's issues of aggregation within ecosystems, there's issues of even across ecosystems of similar types in different places, and then across multiple ecosystems. The real question then becomes, how do you take account of the relative importance of the different characteristics or the different ecosystem services when you're trying to do aggregation? And there's different approaches you can use. One of them obviously is to use prices of the different characteristics or the prices of the different services in order to indicate their relative importance. And that's when you get into valuation approaches. And one question might be, do you really need to aggregate? If you've organised the information in a way, are we happy to assign relative importance to a discussion about the relative importance of the various bits of information rather than forcing it through an aggregation process? I think it's an open question. The Seer does go, I'm not going to go into it, but the Seer does cover issues of valuation and how you might go about the accounting. But the crux of the matter is in this stocks and flows story of the previous diagram. So, on to the take forward messages. I started this section with why GDP has been so successful. Why is it that sort of accounting has been around for so long and GDP seems to have hung on for 70 years despite the slings and arrows of many, many people? These are my 5 reasons. One is it focuses on flows and not stocks. Fundamentally, I think people find it really difficult to consider stocks. It's very easy to measure flows. So a lot of the attacks on GDP are that it's not a very good flow measure, that there are better measures of welfare, there's other things that we considered. The fundamental issue, and this is the sustainability question, is what's happening to the stocks that are generating the flows. And there's not enough focus on those. So, but GDP's been successful because it's on flows and everyone likes talking about flows. it's robust. You can measure it in 3 different ways and conceptually get the same answer. So it's pretty hard to knock over when you want to have a go at it. It's broad. It's trying to measure a whole economy. It's not trying to do something particular about manufacturing or transport. It's trying to cover something very broad. It's not policy dependent, whether you're a Keynesian or a monetarist or whatever. It's a whole set of economic data that doesn't depend on how you want to view it and interpret it. So there's a clear distinction between measurement and recording and policy use and application. And it brings together a whole lot of relevant stuff. So the question from my point of view is, if these are the factors which make a real difference in something being a lasting measurement, can they also be applied in an ecosystem context? And for me, the answer is yes. So message 1 is that accounting approaches can work, including for ecosystems. You get the integrated data on stocks and flows. You don't need to do it all in monetary terms. Physical's fine. You can, in theory, at least get to a comprehensive national scale. And the accounting approach doesn't imply adjusting for GDP and doing those sorts of things, but the real benefit lies in this organisation of relevant information. Message 2, the ambition should not be to set up a perfect set of information, but to somehow put together information that's useful for decision making. Which means that you want to go at this gradually, build it up over time, start with physical, move to monetary, start with doing depletion of natural resources because the methods on that are sort of more broadly accepted, then perhaps move into ecosystems, or do both at the same time. I mean, it really depends on what's available and how to take it forward. And that last point of ensuring a focus on stocks, I think is really quite important. In my view, you need to measure both ecosystem services and ecosystem condition, both the stocks and the flows. It's really, based on what we know at the moment, from what I can work out, there's not sufficient, you can't be sufficiently confident that you can infer the condition from the flows. And as a result, ecosystem services is necessary, but not sufficient. At the same time, ecosystem condition is necessary, but not sufficient either, because in order to assess condition, you need to have some idea of how it's being used, some assessment of how it's going to be used into the future as well. So all of that sort of comes together, and both sides are needed. And finally, engage and befriend your local national accountant and your statistical office. If the issue is making ecosystem services count, these are the people who have the ability to institutionalise data, to bring it together, to take it out of a broader research discourse and do it on a regular basis. And I think there's, that's not to say statistical officers are begging for this type of work. Many of them are not. But at the same time, they do recognise that in actual fact, beyond GDP is really where things have to go. And I think making those connections and those partnerships would be an excellent thing from your point of view. So thank you very much for the opportunity, and I look forward to talking to some of you.